Yeah, so because it's cool to hear your theories. You're a theorist.
Yes, I am that. Yeah, so if you finish my book, I just am doing the references and one final read through. I'll be sending that off in about a week to 10 days to the publisher. So that's the problem of psychology and a new vision for its solution.
And is this popular press, or is this more of like
the academic? It's an academic book.
Okay, gotcha.
So this is sort of it's part two. It builds off my first book, and then can be thought of as a part two to it, basically an extension. I mean, it's not officially a part two, but it's the extension of the argument about why we need this and what it means.
So what's your arc? Like, what's like the elevator pitch of like the book?
The elevator pitch is my first book, A New Unified Theory of Psychology, argued that the first four key ideas created an architecture for the meta-theoretical structure of the field, so that you could look at the key insights of the major schools of thought and assimilate and integrate them, as well as the major empirical findings, to afford an architecture that makes sense of the whole.
Right.
Okay. So that's what that does. This says actually psychology itself, the field is actually anchored in a flawed philosophical metaphysical structure. Okay. So whereas this is meta-theoretical, I'm going to then say, well, yeah, and there's an even deeper problem that the field faces. Okay. The field, modern empirical psychology, is anchored to a methodological behaviorism. Okay. And what that means is the actual definition of psychology is the science of behavior and mental process, where behavior is defined by the epistemology of science, like behavior is what we can measure and see.
Right.
And then mental processes are inferred.
Okay? Right. Yeah. Skinner, and like cognitive science 1.0, basically.
Cognitive science 1.0.
Okay? And a measurement-loving psychology just loves behaviorism because they can.
Well, it loves behavior. So Skinner says psychology is the science of behavior. Mainstream says psychology is the science of behavior and mental process. So then your research programs is to explore the mental process. Okay. That's what so you then, based on the findings of your independent, dependent variables and correlation matrices, and then you infer the iterative mental process. Okay. But then the entire science of psychology is defined by the epistemological methods of science, meaning that it's what we can see, behavior, that's the epistemological methods, and the behavioral science methods. And then we'll do research based on it. And indeed, if you read a Psych 101 mainstream textbook, it's the key in psychology is that we're a science. Okay. And unlike folk psychology, we apply the methods.
So how are you challenging that? Yeah.
Well, that's methodological behaviorism. And I'm arguing that the idea that you would build an identity of a specific science on the idea of applying scientific methodology, there's something odd about that. I mean, all sciences are applying scientific methodology. And it says that, well, most sciences, certainly the natural sciences, have a clear ontological referent, the thing in the world that they're about.
Right, right. So that's what's missing from like a method first point of view, is like you're not honoring the ontological referent. Okay.
Right. And then there's a reason is because of the enlightenment gap, we never had a philosophical system that could actually define with any consensual clarity what we mean by the mental. And that's why we default to a methodological agreement about what the science of psychology is, because we can't get an ontological. You can't get an ontological because of the enlightenment gap.
Yeah, there really isn't like a philosophy of psychology where there is a philosophy of biology or a philosophy of philosophy.
Well, sort of. I mean, there is a lot on philosophy of psychology,
but there is, but I mean, you can't go to a graduate program and find like a philosophy of psychology. Maybe in Europe there might be one or something.
And more in Europe than
I can't think of in the U.S. that's even like a domain.
There's a Division 24. It's just theoretical and philosophical psychology.
Okay, so there is a small, but is there any graduate programs on that?
There are a few graduate programs.
Yeah, because I've looked at all of them.
Like Western Georgia is a graduate program in theoretical psychology.
Okay.
Others, but they're small. The vast majority of Division 24 is dominated by critical theory. So most identify. Oh yeah, totally.
Well, that's a bummer.
I mean, I spent there for 5 years. I was program director for a Division 24 conference.
Oh wow!
I mingled there for a while. Yeah. Ran for president once, and was trying to argue that we needed a constructive as well as critical approach
Yeah. Psychologists are not like, they're not that deep, surprisingly, a lot of times.
And
Even
so
Roy Baumeister is not like, he's not internally consistent, and he's one of the most cited like theory, like he has theories on will and God and reason.
No, he's unbelievably prolific and really interesting character, but he's not grounded deeply in what I then had to learn about the sort of fundamental architecture of concepts.
So what are some like ontological questions that psychologists should be asking?
Well, the first is, what is our subject matter about? What do you mean by the mental? Okay. Or human, or where do you draw the line? Okay. And then at least UTOK says, oh, what you actually are missing, if you don't have the right ontology, there are actually 3 lines in nature that you better be.
Right. You have life, and
life
then
to
animal,
mind,
and then cultural kind of.
So there's a joint point between living organisms into mental animals. So you need to know what that is. Okay. Or mind, which by mental animals, I just mean animals that are minded, which means they have sensory motor looping functions and behave as animals as a whole unit. That's a functional effect on the environment relation. Okay.
That's animal.
So that's animal mental. Okay. But you have to attend, and what makes them different in the language of UTOK is that mental here is the adjective that makes their behavior patterns so different than living. Just like living is an adjective that makes plants and cells so different than inanimate rocks.
Oh, I've never heard you say that as an adjective. That makes a lot more sense, because like moss is just reacting or something, but it's alive.
It's a growth, metabolism, living structure. Okay, that's engaging in the environment in a bio-intelligent, complex, adaptive way. Okay, but moss doesn't get up and move around as a whole.
Right. There's no memory in the same way we have memory.
There's a qualitative difference, and all it is actually the nervous system basically operates as a superimposed information processing system on biology, and then it organizes the whole, and the iterative feedback loop of the whole and the nervous system creates a higher order superimposed information processing, and then with other animals, communication network structure that gives rise to the way animals operating in the world. That's a cold nested dimension above living creatures.
And so even animals have a network effect. That's part of being at the animal level, not the life level. Okay.
I mean, just so go through the woods. Okay. Go for a walk in the woods. You'll see the trees actually are communicating with each other. Okay. But at the level of space-time that we're used to, okay, the squirrels, the bees, and the birds behave totally differently than the trees and the flowers and the moths. And that's all.
And they can't replicate too. That's like one of the criteria from Darwin is like, can you have children? And like a squirrel and a tree can't have a child. So they're
well, they're certainly not the same species,
so that's what I mean. Like these are 2 different genuses,
2 totally different, right? And then we classified it all, and every society everywhere differentiates animals from plants and the rest of the living kingdom. Every society, precisely because plants behave so differently. So the way I do this, also another way of doing this, imagine 3 cats in a tree. One's dead, it falls. Okay. And that's physical behavior. One's anesthetized, it drops, it overtly looks like physical behavior. You cut it open, it's biological, physiological behavior. Okay, where the system is operating and maintaining complex functional design, very much like moss or the plants, but overall and then the third drops, lands on its feet, and runs away. That's meant, the description of that class of functional activity is mental behavior.
So it's not just being tossed around by the world, like plants kind of are in this.
Plants, they do not have a sensory motor structure that affords the capacity of the behavior as a whole as a functional impact in real time.
Right.
An iterative process.
So in like, so time matters a lot, because like sunflowers can track the sun, but that's not really like in the time scale that we care about as animal over here.
It's not and it's not a sensory nervous system loop. And the nervous system, like the way DNA, RNA operates in a nucleus in a eukaryotic cell, that's a whole information processing architecture. The nervous system is a whole superimposed, coordinated information processing nervous system on top of the living biophysiological.
Okay, I like that. Yeah, this is still very Neoplatonic. Translates pretty well.
So then you just label that mindedness, and I'm not making any assertions, and this is the domain of mind 1, because there's another domain, mind 2, that's going to come on, which is like, oh, does the squirrel feel happy, sad, pain, pleasure, what's going on in the subjective conscious experience of a squirrel, what's it like to be a squirrel or a bat, to use Nagel's frame. This is then mind 2, and we're not going to say anything about that just yet.
Okay.
Right now, we're just sitting from the outside, watching the behavior, which should have been termed mental behavior. This is the great mistake of the behaviorists. It's not that they're interested in behavior per se, which is available by the scientific method and can measure. It's that we're interested in a particular kind of behavior. Okay, that's why we're not interested in cells. We're interested in the behavior of animals as a whole, as they push buttons in cages or engage in mating rituals or hunt.
Yeah, and they're able to like simulate reality in their mind, and they're able to have an inner life and stuff like that.
Well, this is a great question.
Okay, yeah.
So that when, how, when, and what that emerges is a great question, and we're pretty limited for 2 fundamental reasons about what we know about mind 2. Okay, mind 2 then is the actual experience of being from behind the eyes of the squirrel. Okay, so the one thing is, we can never see subjective mind 2 experiences directly from the outside. By definition, the epistemic organization is an inside-out epistemic. How you know and what you know is from the inside. You can't see it from the outside.
What if we got squirrels to talk? If we had some way to communicate with them, then we'd be able to.
Well, then that's a night. We have examples of that right now. Okay.
Yeah.
When humans afford an intersubjective propositional highway that connects their minds, aspects of their minds together in the form of justification systems. So you and I get together, get question-answer dialogue, and the propositional network part of my mind is totally available to you to the extent that I decide not to filter it and am honest.
Right.
Okay. So you and I have a highway of mentation that is completely intersubjective because it flows right through our skin without changing its form. Okay, so just say stuff privately to yourself. Hey, I really like this guy and I hate this guy. Say it publicly. Okay. Now, of course, if you say it publicly, then those are your words. You might have consequences.
Well, but we're able to like train our brains. We're able to learn from each other quicker and differently.
And the form of propositions, the semantic syntactical form of proposition, is the exact same inside and out. Okay. Now, your mind 2 space is not. Okay. That's not the same. So I can say, hey, tell me what this red looks like to you.
Yep.
But I can never see the red. I only see the self-reflective narration on the red. Okay. And this is actually Wilhelm Wundt's whole first approach to psychology, which, by the way, for Wilhelm Wundt is this subjective primary orientation. And then it grows into what he calls Volker psychology or folk psychology. But then you have a primary for Wundt, psychology's referent, is the subjective conscious experience of being. That you only have access to through introspection, and then you train introspective observers on their own mind, what I call mind 2, so that they then tell you about red. And then that's
what's really interesting is you can train people to give better self-reports. Like when I was learning data analysis and research skills and stuff like that, that kind of blew my mind because they don't tell that to undergrads really.
No.
But like you start to get into research, you're like, oh, there's definitely people that are more articulate. But then you can also train people to be better participants so that you can get a better picture of their mind, which is just kind of cool. Yeah, their mind too. Yeah.
It's important to have that specifier, but yeah, because it keeps you.
Because the animal instincts are still different. Like we're kind of separating those two.
Well, I mean, there's instincts. There's non-conscious operation, which isn't necessarily instinct. Okay. It depends on what you mean by instinct.
Sure. Yeah. And I took them up in multiple motivation classes, and this was always fuzzy.
Very complicated kind of deal. I mean, you get what are called fixed action patterns, the more technical definition, fixed action patterns into what are called modal action patterns. A fixed action pattern very reliably presents itself with no prior experience to create a stimulus response chaining. That's what a fixed action pattern is. So it reliably presents itself in development to a particular stimulus to create a stimulus response chaining that is reliably specifiable, hence fixed action pattern. It's a procedural knowledge system, okay, to use John's terms, particular kind of procedural knowledge system, which basically embedded in the system is a chain of this stimulus presents itself, then you respond this way, this stimulus responds, and this creates a chain of procedural responses, and then it's a released instinct. That's the best and most obvious definition of what an instinct is.
And part of human difference from other animals is that we don't have as much of that, right? Babies are not reactive the way young owls are or young alligators are. And
there's certainly an argument to be made in relationship to that. There's some debate about that and whether we actually have more flexible instincts that then get shaped, or whether we really don't have instincts. It sort of depends on how you define them.
But
no,
I would generally say that's like that, because
I generally say yes, we have fewer instincts. Okay, that are more embedded in control system, and indeed, this is what you basically get. So early animals, but almost certainly don't even have any sentient experience at all. Are these reflexive systems that are stimulus response controlled systems. Okay. And we can infer this at least from our own experience, because when we drop shit down into pure automatic procedural stuff that's simplistic, what happens? We're able to basically, boom, there's a trigger. We just do it. You now learn to tie your shoe. And although, yes, you need to see your shoes and feel your hands at some level, at a consciousness level, you can do that pretty much away from any, like, I wouldn't even aware I was doing that. Right.
Right. Like in sports, they try to distract the conscious mind so that can happen. Because if you're too conscious, it'll actually sabotage the automatic reaction.
What you want to definitely get out of it in sport is the egoic self-conscious reflector, especially a critical egoic self-conscious reflector that's observing what's going on and wondering if you're going to fuck up.
Right, so right. Sport, you're introducing this bad.
You do not want the egoic narrower on the experiential system. What you want is experiential system flow.
Right.
Okay? That's the primate flow in relationship, which is for John, and you have the proper identity relations between the agent and the arena. And if you have an intuitive identity relation and you have procedural access to skill development, then you're going to get flow in sport. And you don't want a self-conscious propositional thing wondering whether you have that.
It's so interesting that our language system interferes with our motor system. You think that they'd be better integrated somehow, but they really do seem to.
Right. Well, remember the entire minded world is built without an egoic language system.
That's hard to forget. Yeah, it's easy to forget. I know. Yeah.
And then nature tacks on from a UTOK perspective, nature tacks on a rider function that serves as a mental organ of justification on top of your elephant or horse or primate.
So you have the verbal and then the rider on the verbal. Is that what you're saying?
No, the rider essentially emerges as a verbal, as a verbally mediated structure as you engage in culture person activity, i.e. justification, on top of the primate mental behavioral activity.
And that's just because verbal is so efficient, right? Like verbal can just boom, 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 boom. We wouldn't use body language or something else as much.
Right. Well, for sure, to convey particular types of ideas, verbal's unbelievably effective at abstracting and organizing and exploding the possibility of ideological set. And because it affords complete intersubjective highway stuff, we can create cumulative collective intelligence structures, build systems of justification over time. Where it's like, hey, this is true and this is true and this networks together, and somebody else comes along, well, what about this and this network, and that's bullshit. And then it starts to shed bullshit stuff, or at least potentially shed bullshit stuff, and evolve into a larger cumulative collective intelligence, which of course, this is the tremendous intellectual advantage. And then you add to that technological capacity and technological evolution, you get the fusion of capital C culture, the evolution of justification systems, with the evolution of material culture, technological systems. And that's why over the last 100,000 years, 10,000 years in particular, we fucking exploded on the planet, and now we have the Anthropocene.
It's hard to imagine that like there was a time in history when our ancestors were not the alpha predator on the earth.
It wasn't that long ago, man.
I know, but like cosmically it wasn't. But like in my little span.
Well, our whole lives,
like quite a long time.
It's a default, it's our baseline default. So
I love looking at pictographic language development and how it goes from like hands to letters, and you could see like art progress and be able to have more depth perception and more just not interesting. like that's a discovery. Just like learning how vision works is like, oh, we didn't have access to that as a species or as an individual, and now we do. And
Now we do.
yeah, you take
Totally.
all that for
Super
granted
cool.
because we're in such an advanced form of humanity, even.
Right. Well, we are coming up on a lot of, capital C cultural evolution, science in particular, for example, pulled a particular line of thought. Then you get the technological evolution, which is unbelievably transformative. And that's both of those are cumulative. So we get to come in, and of course, the people beyond us, assuming there's not global civilization collapse, will come in later with.
We're gonna do it, Greg. We're gonna get past
doing
this.
it. We're getting through it. Fifth joint point, baby.
What's the fifth joint point?
So, I mean, on the tree of knowledge, the fifth joint point. So each joint point is the phase transition. So you go from energy information implicate order to the material explicate order. That's joint point number one. Big Bang is the process. And then you get the joint point number two, which is matter to life. And that's the emergence of the living, natural selection, genetic cell theory. And then there's joint point number three, behavioral investment theory, which people generally miss, but it happens with the Cambrian explosion, evolution of nervous systems. And I mean, actually, here's a book that happens to be right here. That's basically saying exactly this metazoa, animal life, and the birth of the mind in the Cambrian explosion. Basically, you get complex active bodies, and then they engage in prey-predation relations, and that really explodes the behavioral investment system because you got to eat and avoid being eaten, and that's a much more. Now they have to behave on real time against each other. And that's what drives that evolution. So before they just preyed on plants, and then when you start preying on each other, then you get a complex active sensory motor loop.
Yeah, you better be better game player.
You're an arms world. It's an arms race now, and prey predation arms race, and then that's really going to drive the behavioral investment system as a functional behavior of a whole.
Yeah, and we still even do that within species. Like we still like our wars generate new technologies and stuff. So it's not even like between 100%. Species.
So we get the Cambrian explosion, you get the basic body plan, and then you get the explosion. And in particular, you get insects, they go a particular way, mollusks go a particular way, and vertebrates. And then the vertebrates trail on the fishes, and they trail and spread into the reptiles, spread into the birds and mammals and dinosaurs, of course. And then we get the mammals into primates, and then we get the hominid primate. And the hominid primate of 500,000 years ago starts doing, maybe of 2 million years ago, really starts syncing up their the pre-verbal intersubjectivities. So they can now coordinate their activity with shared attention and intention. Tomasello's insight.
Powerful, the ability so we can start to hunt together. To problem solve is like that's why I studied in graduate school as teams, and like the last 50 years of research and org psych has been like teams has just ballooned, and hiring individuals matters, organizations clearly matter, like the US government has a lot of influence in the world, but like teams are so powerful. If you have an awesome team or no team or a bad team, so different. I mean, like you, Christopher and John, like you produce stuff that you couldn't produce alone, or it would take like 10 years, you're doing it in 10 weeks. And even the listserv, right? Like the people are spreading ideas with common care and going, oh, cool, I have this new thing to think about, or we had this great dialogue and now I'm different because of it. So the between the micro and the macro, the meso is such a powerful thing. And that's how like kind of tribes and shamans beat monkeys. Like that, could you imagine it being 2 a.m. and having no home and like apes invading your camp? Like that would be terrifying in Africa. And then we just figured that problem out and it's not a problem anymore. But that was like humans lived through that. That would be,
of course,
insane.
Amazing. So right. And then anyway, in terms of what the ontology, if we go back to some of what we were saying, what you need to get all of this right is you need the life to mind joint point. Okay, you need to know there are different dimensions of complexification. There's a joint point. You got to get into mindedness. And behavioral investment theory gives you the joint point. Tree of knowledge gives you the descriptive metaphysics to map that ontological dimension. Then you get from animal mindedness into culture persons. Okay, and then culture persons are mind 3, and they have a totally different set of mental processes on top of the old mental process. And so you can't just use the word mental process, or you have to know what you're talking about in relation to mind 1, mind 2, or mind 3. Mind 3 is this justificatory intersubjective, so the first is kind of available through the objective outside, the second only available through the inside subjectively, and the third is an intersubjective shared language system. So these are three totally different epistemologies to see the different 3 minds, which are also different reference. So then you gotta understand that. And then finally you have to understand science and its epistemology and what it does relative to the subject. And those are two very, very different domains. And that UTOK gives us a coin for the subjective psyche and the tree of knowledge for science. So we can now blend the split between life and mind, and the split between mind and culture, and the split between science, mapped by the tree of knowledge as a holistic, naturalistic ontology, and the coin, which then places each of us in our subjective, qualitative, idiographic experience of being.
So how is science different than culture? Because I always think of that.
Well, so it's culture, science sits in culture. Culture is the emergence of justification systems.
Yeah, that I get.
Okay.
That I get.
Capital C.
Medicine.
So then
like you and I work together, we build a system of medicine.
We built a system, right, which is an interlocking network of propositions. Now, initially, these initial propositions are basically social convention and complete pragmatism. Okay, in the sense that you have common sense, you have an argumentation, you have analysis, you have problem solving. Okay, but this, at least at a simple story, let's tell this a simple story of the West. Okay, and I want to be clear that the claims that UTOK makes is embedded in a trajectory of justification. I'll say that again, the claims that UTOK makes is embedded in a trajectory of justification.
Yeah,
in fact, that is the way justification systems evolve.
Right.
And they're contextualized by the things that came before them and then define themselves in relation and then against relation and thesis, antithesis, and then get synthesized. And so they have their whole history.
Right. That's where history matters, really.
History matters. And the claims that I make are situated in that history. So if you were in, Chinese thinking and the definitions and justifications of those histories, you're not necessarily going to find yourself in the same kind of problems or potentialities or anything else. That doesn't mean they can't be corresponded. But
no, that's important because culture matters. And there's this cultural relativism that says it's all the same. But like every time a language dies on Earth, we lose knowledge. We lose
100%
good stuff. And
so to me, here's the basic. So I'm embedded. So here's the very short. I mean, this is a long, obviously rich history. I am only the outline. I could give more than I'm giving here. But let's just do it this way.
Yeah, no, that's interesting.
You get Pythagorean. Let's just do Greeks to the scholastics to science. Okay. Let's just do these
I know all those. Yeah, that's good.
All right. So the Greeks come along, at least the story of the West. If you have to Alexander Bard, he hates this fucking story. But anyway, this is because it's overly simple.
He's into Zoroaster. Yeah. He wasn't so well.
Yeah, he goes over there. He wants Silk Road trade, Persian, Zoroastrian thinking, and they solved all these problems a while ago. But that's
the Greeks were so ahead of their time. Like you look at other cultures at that time, the art, the just the idea of writing down history the way they did, the poetry, the proto-science. Like I would if I had to time travel to any culture more than 500 years ago, the Greeks seem awesome. They were some of the most smart, interesting people ever to live on Earth. So I'm with you. I'm not with Bard.
Right. Anyway, I just want to position the story. So, and then we'll say Pythagorean comes along, okay, and then the analysis of mathematics, okay, gives rise to an angle on potential truths that transcend social and subjective knowledge. Okay, so the Pythagorean a squared plus b squared equals c squared and a right triangle is true, whether you believe it or not. Okay, and then there's an opportunity.
So math knowledge is like better than linguistic knowledge. It's like a step up on linguistic knowledge.
Potential,
kind of shorthand.
Okay, certainly is a shorthand, and it opens up this question of true, okay, relative to bullshit. All right. And I would then argue that Socrates formalizes epistemology. What Socrates is doing, he's formalizing epistemology. What I mean by that, he's just asking about the justifications that people have and revealing the vast majority of justifications to essentially be contextual social convention.
Right.
Basically, he's arguing that virtually all of what gives rise to the human activity in terms of, we're going to do justice here, we're going to create politics here, we're going to do all this, is a socially conventioned bullshit. Okay.
Right. Plato says you have to know the reason why. If you're only doing something without knowing the reason why, it's not real knowledge. It's like opinion. Is I think how it would fit in
and he's arguing that basically most people are wandering around saying they have knowledge, but it's ultimately shared public opinion that they can't really justify. That's why, in fact, Socrates is like, why is Socrates the wisest man? Because he admits he knows nothing. Okay. So it's really an epistemological critique on the social construction of knowledge is a good one way to see what Socrates does. Okay. And then you get Plato and Aristotle come along and say, hey, can we build metaphysical systems that are up to the task of a refined attack, a skeptical, refined epistemological attack? Like, can we build justified true belief systems, to use Plato's reference? And then you get this basic structure of a Platonic form versus Aristotle's material. I mean, there's sophisticated relations between them, but you get these two broad metaphysical systems from Plato and Aristotle. And these become, for West, the first real systematic metaphysical systems, okay, that then have huge influence, and you get the birth of philosophy, which is essentially building, what is our metaphysical picture of reality? And then how do we epistemologically justify it? And what does it say about ontology? And so you now have and now what that's doing is it's taking out everyday justification and shifting everyday social convention justification to refined analysis of what is true, what is bullshit, what is good, etc. So it's a refined analysis. That's what philosophy does. It refines our analyses of justification.
Yeah, when you have better definitions and more reliable insights, then you've got this whole different platform to stand on. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. Totally. Yeah. And what I'm saying, we were talking about cultural, cumulative, collective intelligence and their evolution of justification. Well, you can see this is a kind of evolution of justification where people are, hey, what's a good, hey, I build pyramids because sun god Ra appoints me pharaoh. I do this, I do that. What's the real justification for this? And now you have sophisticated analytic angles that are raising all sorts of skepticism, and then people trying to find the metaphysical ground that has refined definitions and plausibility that gives rise to these systems of belief that would withstand a Socratic questioning structure and be able to justify their integrity at the level of truth claims. And this then gives rise to philosophy, essentially, which is the systematic approach to defining justifiable knowledge. Certainly the way in which you can frame a philosophy that way. So in the justification systems angle now, we're exploring the evolution of justification systems and placing Socratic philosophy into Plato and Aristotelian philosophy and in a particular evolution of justification systems themselves. Okay.
And without that, psychology, just to bring it back up to date, is not on solid ground. Their definitions, because they're not well justified and having a consensus that's grounded, it's almost back to the pre-axial time where it's God Ra, but it's God Skinner and God Agamemnon or whatever. It's all just ego battles and popularity and opinion.
Okay, so now they're trying to build refined systems. Okay, let's fast forward to the scholastics. Okay, scholastics in 15th century, they've now combined Christianity with Greek and Plato. I mean, with Aristotle, with the Greeks, Plato and Aristotle. Scholasticism is essentially trying to build these metaphysical systems that are internally consistent. Okay, but they basically spin off, arguably, in a way that then basically creates tautological systems.
Right.
Okay. So, opiate, the goal of opiate is normativity. And then basically the reason opiate makes this way because it's achieving its normativity. Well, it's the opiate has the effect, and now you're saying it caused the effect, had the effect, the reason it was caused, now you're back and forth. And what looks like a cool explanation on the surface is actually just a bullshit tautology. Okay. So Galileo comes along and he hates metaphysics, scholastic metaphysics. Okay. And he's like, this is all a bunch of bullshit. What we need to do, we can't just sit around and do armchair philosophy, building internally consistent, coherent systems within themselves that are not relative corresponding to the actual facts of the world.
Right. There are these language games that kind of
you get the language games and you get internal.
Yeah.
And then you with the discovery from Copernicus and to Galileo and these kinds of with the heliocentric shift, okay, this is an unbelievable mindset shift, was we all could look and see that the sun rotates around the earth, and it made perfect sense and conformed to our perception until we actually really systematically got data, looked at it from other angles, and realized that entire conception was essentially bullshit, or at least if you take the heliocentric version, okay?
Yeah, and then that's what's so interesting about progresses in technology is that they allow us to reflect on our ontology and our knowledge systems and go, I thought it was vapors, but it was actually
So-
bacteria or
Right,
whatever, which
exactly,
is not inconsequential. Okay.
And so what Galileo is the father of modern empirical natural science. Okay. So now I'm going to situate us and say, okay, yeah, we're talking, and we're going to extend the centuries, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. Okay. We're going from natural philosophy into what will become modern empirical natural science. And Galileo's the father of that. He hates metaphysics. Okay. Which in this case is just defined as internally consistent descriptions that aren't connected to the world.
Yeah.
Or at least Galileo will make that argument. Okay.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
he
that's kind
wants
of what John is against too, right? Is these belief-centric that aren't actually verifiable and don't progress.
Anybody that then gets raised in a post-science epistemology will be very critical of self-serving, internalized tautological systems that don't anchor themselves also in a correspondent theory of truth. So the correspondent theory of truth says that you have to engage your mapping model of reality with a feedback loop, okay, that tests it at some level. Okay. And then the scientific method is the process by which we're going to then structure a methodological epistemology that creates an iterative feedback to build correspondent theories with reality. Okay. Now, how does it do that? Basically, what Galileo says, we need empirical observation. Okay. That then can be transferred to a quantifiable measurement, so that the empirical observation is available to anybody that has the training to be able to see it. Okay. This becomes then third-person empiricism, so that the data that we're going to ground is data that's available to any trained observer. And then we're going to quantify it, and we're going to then map it quantifiably, and then engage an experiment to analyze causation and rule out other causation and deduce or abduct the cause, a general causal mechanism. Okay. This is the essence then of science. So it's a correspondent theory of truth, not a coherence theory. Correspondent. Okay. Certainly there has to be some coherence, but it's not looking for any general coherence, which is what Plato and Aristotle were looking for. Okay. It's looking for the model that you build, the mapping of that model, the ability to gather data, quantifiable data in particular, to create logical, deductive, empirical, which becomes logical positivism or logical empiricism, where the logic is the quantifiable relations, the relations between deduction and the relationship between the data that's available to anybody, okay, through a measurement structure that affords you to translate it into quantifiable mathematics. And that's what you basically get as the epistemological structure of what I call men's knowledge, sometimes modern empirical natural science. Okay. Now that's super important to know, because what they actually are trying to do is they're trying to get at what it does is methodologically, it puts the knower on the outside of the system. It's an outside in epistemological position. In order to do that, because you have to get data from it, and that data has to be available to any other observer. Okay. That immediately means that what they call the secondary qualities, what becomes qualia, which are the inherent characteristics of qualia, or mind two, is that it's fundamentally not observable from the outside. Okay.
Yeah, because it all adapted like just through time in nature and popped out. And that's what like mind two is basing its
mind two. Well,
on.
I mean, whatever we say mind two is, it is the case that I can observe your mind two directly, even though it presents itself directly to you.
Mm-hmm.
And vice versa. This is the issue of, can you see that the red I see is the red you see? We can talk about it, and you can share propositions.
At some point, could we know enough about like vision to say that I know Greg is seeing the same red as me?
Well, you can get better and better deductive claims to make that the case, okay? But you can't know it, I would argue.
Okay.
Well, maybe we will eventually, but you can't know it in the same non-deductive way that you know how you experience red, and you can't know it with the same degree of certitude.
Yeah.
The way you know red would be fundamentally different than the way you would infer that I know red.
Mm-hmm. So great. So we have science, and it gathers data to create systems of justification, which have more power than mind two does to act in the world.
Right. And because, well, mine too is situated in a particular context. The goal of science is to generalize across, get rid of error or manage error, and find the underlying causal, reliable, invariant mechanisms that are giving rise to change. That's what science wants.
So then,
Okay,
like, to live in a good scientific culture, don't the people need to be well trained in reading science? Isn't that going to be almost always necessary?
Ideally, but of course that doesn't happen. But
yeah, because I mean that's part of the problem of like we deify science is because people don't know how to read it, and then they think they do, and they use it without understanding it.
Totally. And by the way, we're talking about right here. Okay, there's two different meanings of the word science. So this is science as epistemology and method. Okay. So it's the emergence, and then there's science as ontology or knowledge, the public knowledge that emerges out of science. So the periodic table of the elements is a knowledge structure. Evolution's a knowledge structure. What we're talking about here is the epistemological methods of science. So you have to be able to differentiate epistemology from knowledge, okay, onto ontological claims about the reality. And of course, the ontological claims are then justified by the methods usually, and the overarching logic structure.
And they're in a feedback relationship, like they're
feedback relation.
Yeah.
There is no general scientific worldview. Okay. Because of that, then the ontological claims that are science can be locally placed in particular subjects, but there is no then generalized context of a scientific worldview.
And that's part of the problem.
That's
that, like, everyone needs a worldview, and we love science, and we lost our worldview.
Totally.
And so the world, like, how does one get a worldview back then without reverting to like something simpler that didn't work?
Right. Well, you follow the attempts, okay, and then understand the attempts, and then the good news is actually a better than ever attempt is now on the doorstep. At least that's the UTOK good news. Okay. So the attempts of it are people to build systems of the natural into human world and try to argue for coherence about them. This goes back to Auguste Comte was doing this, put sociology on top, and all of them have a basic outline feature. Okay. All of them, especially now since the 20th century. What is the basic outline feature? The basic outline feature, especially ever since Big Bang, is an emergent view on time by complexity. Okay. So all the big picture views of science, basically ever since, especially Big Bang gets established, so the back half of the 20th century, all have essentially the same picture. Big Bang gives rise to particles. Particles organize into atoms. Atoms get into aggregates, which starts to form stars and galaxies. In certain contexts, more different atoms appear in meteors and planets. You get these different complicated molecules. And then in one particular hand, those complicated molecules jump into living systems, and then they jump into big life systems, and then they jump into humans. And now we have humans on the top of this complexity system. And that's it's called an emergent natural view. And that emergent natural view is essentially present across virtually every person that takes a scientific big picture view. I don't really know of any people skeptical about its utility and what it really tells you, but everyone that's doing in the affirmative big picture view, and this gets solidified probably in the biggest sort of systematic approach to try to do this, called big history. So big history, launched by Dave Christian and established itself as a particular kind of, hey, we need to do this in a particular way. And then so there's an institution, how big it is and all this other stuff. It's basically, and it's a time by complexity. It says, hey, starts with Big Bang, and there are 8 thresholds that have emerged across time. If you look at E.O. Wilson's Consilience, if you look at Sean Carroll's Big Picture, if you look at Rolston's 3 Big Bangs, they all do this. Okay. So there is the outline of a naturalistic worldview, and it's on these 2 axes. Okay. At the same time, if you are aware of the problem of psychology, well, first off, I'll say this. You can look out and you can be like, okay, what is our shared understanding? And obviously there's no shared understanding that's up to the task. We live in a chaotic, fragmented pluralism.
Well, that's the problem. It's like that cosmology isn't enough, it seems.
It's not enough. And Robert, we can say why it's not enough from a sophisticated level. So,
okay, yeah, tell me why. This is interesting.
Sophisticated people need, so this is an outline, but if you're okay, I was just talking to somebody who's working on quantum theory and lasers and states of matter. Okay? Yeah. the specificity, this big picture doesn't fucking matter. He needs to get involved. Okay. So one thing is you got to get really in the details. You have to be deliberate about why you need a big picture. It doesn't do a lot for specific correspondence science.
Right.
So we set it up so that we really created all sorts of silos to get specific knowledge and didn't realize how important the big picture knowledge was. And we lost hold of that. There are lots of reasons for why we lost hold of that, but that was a big mistake educationally on the one hand. But there's also the reason is that you can't hold it together. Okay. Why can't you hold it together? Because you can't really place a good theory of human knowing and sentience and consciousness and mind in general in relationship to the matter and motion picture. You can't do that.
Yeah.
Okay. And everybody that's like, you can draw the line, but you can't do it with any specificity. Well, how do we know? The problem of psychology, problem of my discipline. Okay. You can track that, you get natural science, relative coherence of the natural sciences, so that the physicists and astronomers and particle physicists and matter state theorists and all those other people. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of debate, but they know they're about the behavior of matter and energy across scale. And then the chemists are totally on top of them. They know that it's grounded in atomic theory down to quantum theory, right? And then you can go into geologists. They're certainly conciliant with the rest of the physical sciences broadly defined. And now we get biology, which is totally, anchored into, we get a biochemistry and a molecular biology. We basically understand that process. And then you expand biology out into ecology. You expand it ultimately into neuroscience. And then you get into things like ethology, okay, sociobiology. That's the natural sciences. Okay. But it bottoms out in its ontological coherence there.
And then you need philosophy there or something.
Well, what should happen is the proper conception of psychology. That's what at least UTOK says. That actually we got, the first people that studied animals across the span were psychologists, by the way.
Comparative psych is awesome. It's really
comparative psychology.
Fun
and in fact,
interesting.
The best C. Broad was one of the greatest emergent naturalists, and he was a comparative psychologist.
Yeah.
George Romanes analyzed. Anyway, there are all this different stuff on early. The people that looked at animal behavior were mental behaviorists doing comparative psychology, and they should have stayed there. But because we didn't have the right definition, psychology bounces all around. Okay. Because is it about that kind of mind? Is it mind one, animal behavior? Is it just mind two, subjective conscious experience? But how do we fit that in science? Is it just human minds, like Rene Descartes talked about, and just the human mind in the societal context? People totally disagree about whether psychology's primary referent is all animals, some animals that start to have mind too, and we don't know where that is. Only the human animal that can self-consciously reflect. No one agrees.
Yeah, and because you don't see that it's all under the skin, so you don't see that there's these layers happening and interacting, and you go, no, that's one thing. People are one thing. Why could there be three things that describe so deeply and broadly this one thing? But when you look at like evolution over time, like biomes to me remind me of like culture. It's like, oh, there were these plants and rocks, and then because they were there, some new ones could come, and then because those were there and some lava flowed in, then these new ones could come, and like the sulfur made it so they didn't need as much vitamin C, so that allowed this to come. And like over billions of years, a lot of really cool living things that are curious and loving and hateful and deadly, all the myriad of qualities can exist. But if you have a really simple view and you're like, what, it was nothing and then something, so how is something even possible? So yeah, no, I think, and so your book will then just talk about how the last 500 years or 400 years or so kind of have been making chaos of human culture or something.
Well, the first two chapters diagnose the problem of psychology. Okay, and it says,
just like you just did,
just like I did. There's no referent. It's very different than between physics, chemistry, and biology, which biology tells you is a science of life. So there's an ontological referent for biology. Why then, when we get to psychology, there's no ontological referent?
Right.
That's interesting. That's an interesting fact.
Yeah, yeah. Referents are important. If you don't refer, if something is a force in your system, and you are, if it's invisible to your, especially if you're such a verbal creature, and it's not on the verbal landscape, then you're in trouble.
Yep. So the argument is that we don't have a architectural landscape that allows us to place the proper reference, that is the domain of psychology, and its various monus elements, especially at line 1, line 2, line 3, in proper epistemological ontological relation. Never have been able to do that. And that's the essence of it. And that's why it gives rise to the problem of psychology. Okay. So then we diagnose the problem, say there's no subject matter, and then say the solution is to drop back into methodological behaviorism. In other words, grounded in epistemology instead of ontology. And then I critique that and say that's a mistake. What I then want us to move from, what the book basically says, is we can move from a methodological behaviorism to a mental behaviorism.
Can you say the difference? What's
mental behaviorism tells you what we mean by mental.
Okay, so just having this correlational method with poor definitions and bad reference
so first off, there's mindedness. Go for a walk in the woods, check out the squirrels, the bees, and the birds. They are behaving mentally. That's mental behavior. That describes the adjective of them behaving as whole creatures that have functional effect. The behaviorists got this all fucking wrong by just calling it behavior. They should have called it mental behavior.
Yeah, because it is tricky when you talk about behaviors of hurricanes and geology and cells, the same way you say, like, the word behavior, it even just in Buddhism, they make you distinguish between objects and people, and that's hard to do as a human being. But if you're conflating them and you're building a verbal system,
so you want to basically, say, okay, here's energy information, that's the base, and then you get into matter. Okay, that's okay. So then these are clustered frozen energy, and they behave in particular ways. And then you get into cells. We can factor out the physiochemistry and then leave behind the biological intelligence. Actually, that's a complex adaptive behavioral structure that affords the system to be an autopoietic growth system. Okay. Then you can do the exact same thing with mental. That's what I did with the 3 cats. So the 3 cats is a physical thing. You can factor that out. That's physical behavior. You can factor out biological living behavior. And then you can have mental behavior, which is a superordinate structure on biological behavior, allows the behavior of an animal to behave as a functional whole. Okay. You can imagine a 4th cat. All right. Imaginary 4th cat. It drops and says, why the fuck did you drop me out of this tree? Well, that's a culture person magic cat. Okay. That magic cat then sassy? It's a sassy human cat, person cat. Okay. Well, that's that's culture person plane. Okay. Justification plane. So now we can say, oh, these are different kinds of behavioral patterns. There's material behavioral pattern. There's a living organism pattern. There's a mental animal pattern and a culture person pattern.
Yeah. And at each level, there are such huge differences. And if you're conflating, not only are you're just not smart enough to have good definitions to start with, but even if you are smart and you're conflating or ignoring, then and the theories are building on these bad theories, then so
John will talk a lot about equivocation.
Well, equivocation. I taught the LSAT, and like learning how to think logically it takes a long time, and being around researchers, they're so smart, but like they're not self-critical like all of us. Like we're like, oh, it's them and I'm different. And if you're not really careful, and then like you said, once you get into word games, what was it, James Lindsay was publishing those fake papers because he played the word game. He said, oh, I figured out your word game, you like lots of data and these words, and I just became a fabulous publisher without being real. And
right.
So the fact that almost just proves that how bad psychology is or can be, because
certainly can be.
If you just play the word game with a bunch of data like the dead fish voxel, it's like, no, that's not what you're saying it is, and you're saying it very confidently, and people are copying you. So
it's trouble.
So I mean, it's such a big deal to have a and I think I talked about this last time with you. Like economics has a history where it believed in mercantilism and it believed in like really, really bad ideas, but because they had other good things going for them, those bad ideas propagated with the good ideas. And then they go, oh wait, no, productivity matters. If we don't do anything, then our well-being is lower than if we do something. And it doesn't matter how much gold or silver we have or spice or whatever. It matters like the education level and different kinds of capital and et cetera. And then all of a sudden, ooh, now we understand how capital is in 4 levels and we can do all this amazing stuff with it. So like having this aha moment of realizing your system is so bad can just unlock so much power and like move things forward.
Well, I'm not optimistic that's going to happen, but the argument is the potential is there for it to happen. So
well, the science needs other scientists to die. You just need a bunch of the people that are popular now to die, and then your theory to be popular, and then until you die and someone hijacks that, then
it's all about dying off, really. So yeah, basically the bottom line is then once I make the critique, I introduce the UTOK system, mostly still just staying in things like justification and tree of knowledge. Then once they get the tree of knowledge, you make the argument this is a new map of big history. It's consistent really with a sophisticated philosophical analysis of the universe. And then once you have a meta-theoretical and ontological picture, then I bring back the meta theory. And so what mental behaviorism says is that we can create a descriptive metaphysical system, which means the concepts and categories that we're using, like what do we mean by matter and mind, to generate a very clear picture of the ontology of psychology, which is mental behavior in general and human mental behavior in particular, which gives rise to basic psychology corresponding to mental behavior, human psychology corresponding to human mental behavior. Okay, that's the descriptive.
Oh, so you're saying there should be a psychology of like kind of animal and like lower human behavior or something.
Right. Well, that's actually in the UTOK language. Psychology is the science of mental behavior.
Okay, period. Not human.
Period. Okay. Not human. And then that is, what do you mean? It's a complex active body with a brain moving as a functional whole. That's just the definition of mental behavior.
So we'd say bat psychology, human psychology, frog psychology, and that would be how you differentiate some of that stuff.
Although you get all of the animal psychology, which happens with the Cambrian explosion. You start really complex active bodies, brains, yoking them together, behaving in radically different ways than we've seen before. It's understanding those processes that enable us that should be what psychology corresponds to. And then the psychology does have the question about, well, when does mind 2 come on? Subjective conscious experience of beings embedded in that question clearly comes online in the animal community. When, it's a great question. We could talk about what I believe and think the data say. But anyway, there's that question. And then you get another jump. Okay, you get a jump in the human because there's a recursive justificatory dynamic, and they live also on the culture person plane. So humans are both primates, which would be a basic psychology analysis, and persons, which would be mind 3, and that gets you into social psychology, the social sciences. Human psychology sits at the base of the social sciences. Its interface with the social sciences is very similar to the way neuroscience, which is an extension of biology, actually loops back into psychology. And so neuroscience is essentially the biological base of psychology. Well, human psychology is the psychological base of the social sciences.
So yeah, so that's another big problem because psychology is like kind of the queen or the king, and it should be a little lower down in your system with social.
Well, social becomes the social sciences ultimately, right, in terms of the macro level complexified scale, a culture, capital C culture. And then if you want to either do the culture, which are large scale justifications, or society, which is then embeds the large scale justifications in a bioecological behaving vesting techno system, which is an assemblage. But then if you're going to study that,
I love to lose.
The complexity of that assemblage is much more than an individual human. So, but a human is like a neuron to the brain in the society.
Yeah, and so yeah, that's awesome. And
so the bottom line is, just to summarize, so the first book did the meta-theoretical architecture, and now I'm saying actually that wasn't enough. I have to clear out the descriptive metaphysics and ontology, and I'm arguing to replace methodological behaviorism. So now, whereas the first book was like, oh, I'll play along with the system, now the system's got to be gutted and philosophically reorganized at the level of mental behavior, which is a metaphysical ontological argument that then can hold the meta theory. And a psychology that has a clear metaphysics that gives rise to a crisp ontology that can be meta-theoretically organized, that is way better than just doing the methods of science on some godforsaken thing we call behavior and mental process.
No, it's so exciting. You'll love this. I was watching Jonathan Peugeot talk to Donald Hoffman, And I was getting really frustrated because it was getting very circular, and I could see them justifying, like you, I think, you in relationship to all the stuff I've learned from John and from everything else, I'm now more conscious of like how people are justifying, and I started to watch them justify, and they'd say one thing and then use something they said they shouldn't use, and I Googled and I go, Donald Hoffman, John Vervaeke, and then your article on Psychology Today was like the third article, and you're talking about how people just aren't justifying well. There's all this circularity or kind of like just nonsense, really, and they say one thing and they're really panpsychists, and they don't catch themselves in the lie, and it's so high level that if you don't have kind of the either the luck or the skill, then it goes over your head and you assume you're wrong and they're right, or vice versa, they're wrong for no real good reason. And then you go, okay, well, I guess I'm just never going to think about this again. But then you start to think about how people justify things and can examine their claims and their chains of logic, and you go, aha, I caught you. You ate the cookie, you little filthy. And people don't even realize they're doing it, right? We're
Sure, of
so
course.
easy, we're able to say things that we're not able to even like process fully and get confused. And these are smart people, and it's
Oh,
really
of
like,
course. It's a natural, the nature of right. That's why one of the great, well, understanding human justification is a wonderful affordance. I'll put it that way.
well, yeah, and especially the way like it's so important to you, you keep harping on the point. And like, of course, if you're anybody, you have to justify, and justification is kind of second nature. But the way you put it in such a keen place, and because normally if someone's just able to justify really well, then you go, oh, they're smart, I'm going to trust
Hmm.
them, let's do
Hmm.
it. Because it's
Hmm.
kind of distributed cognition, you
Hmm.
have to trust people. Like, I don't know what medical knowledge is. When I go
Of
in
course.
with my 80-year-old mom, I'm just crossing my fingers it works, and correlationally it does. And so I don't question it, because that's
Yep.
how I save time and can
Of course.
specialize in my thing. And then we all just have this system of trust. But really, like, the system is so big, and critical thinking is so weak right now in our culture, that it's really such a payoff to be able to, because within a domain you could say like, oh no, I get that theory, I understand what they're saying, but if you really care about the truth, it's much harder to then, like you said, see beyond the internal consistency to what's happening. And yeah,
Yep.
you're just worried in like a second folk psychology, essentially. And then yeah, now the internet makes information, you can just totally be novelty seeking all the time, never stop and kind of question things, and just full of bad ideas, and they drive behavior whether they're good or bad. So it's not only frustrating as like a researcher to know that people aren't thinking clearly, but you just see it everywhere, where um the persuasive power of like a kind of a charismatic smart person can leave you in the dark. But um yeah, no, logical thinking, and yeah, following the logic versus following the people, like we're such imitators, and kind of for good reasons, right? When you learn to play a sport, you copy, you don't invent,
Totally.
you copy. So we copy before we know. And it makes the argument so much more than just like coffee table talk, when you're like, oh cool, I'm smarter than you, I know Greg's theory and his is better than your theory, so I get social status for
Woohoo.
this. It's like it really matters, because this, like, science is such a god for us right now, and it's led by fools in so many ways. And even within psychology, like motivation, like we were saying at the very beginning, like it matters how you use the terms. And if you don't understand, like if you go back to like the 30s or 40s, people like just all of those great psychologists who were so interesting at the time are, you can't really reckon them if you don't understand how this justification works, and how like and if you say like, oh, we're different than nature, and then you just totally pull yourself into this bogus sphere, um versus like you're saying that Galileo is so interesting, right? Like by these little progresses, they save lives, they make like if you love truth, you should love truth more than your opinion of your sacred cow theory. And I mean, we've talked about this before as well, when even when I get, it's so funny for you to just go, look, I have this thing, it's awesome. And people are like, that hurts my ego unconsciously, get me out of here, or whatever. So yeah, that's awesome. Is there any other parts of the book that you think are interesting or that are exciting you to do, or is that kind of the big gist of it, which is amazing?
I mean, the overall argument, I'll be interested to see if it gets on any traction. I'm very happy with the overall argument. I think that the lining up, the book started in just trying to explain the language system, which when it actually started was the Atua language system. Before it was UTOK in 2020. I actually formalized it as UTOK. I forget sometimes how recent that is, but and I don't get into Goin or the garden at all. It's all still an academic argument. But I really do like the way it evolved as a sort of an extension of the book, a critique against this methodological behaviorism, an analysis of why mental behaviorism is different, and a really pretty clear argument, I think, for a descriptive metaphysics that resolves the enlightenment gap, that solves the problem of psychology, and a meta-theoretical architecture that does give us a complex explanatory network that ties together key insights, key empirical findings, key ideas in a way that gives us finally a coherent intelligibility of the whole. That is, I think, available now in the book, and you read the whole thing and digest it. It's sort of like, this is a qualitative shift, and it's at least lays the groundwork for a genuinely true paradigm of psychology that would allow us to transform from the pre-multi-paradigmatic schools of thought into a true paradigm, as Kuhn argued, and do so with lots of positive implications. Of course, if you know UTOK, there's the coin garden on the other side of this thing, and it's like, oh, there's a whole way to now situate then the solution to scientific psychology in relationship to your idiographic psyche. That's a different thing, but now I can connect the tree to the coin. And then if we marry the tree to the coin to get right relationship, which is our qualities of being in the world plus the behavioral analysis of the world, and then we get right relationship to is, and we can then get right relationship to ought through the garden. At least
how does that work?
Ought.
How does oughting work?
Well, the way I do it in relationship to this is sort of like, okay, the culture person plane, justification systems, although we can analytically differentiate what I call the problem of analysis, or the analytic problem of truth versus the problem of interest and value. You can Hume, and you can ask different kinds of questions about, well, this is true, and you can't then justify directly, deductively, since it's true, we ought to do this. So that's what Hume did, and that's true in certain contexts, but in pragmatic everyday context, if you understand what justifications are, there actually are networking is an ought. The network is an ought for behavioral investment and influence processes. And so then if you're like, okay, well, justification systems actually work as is ought systems in general.
Okay. So it's a split that shouldn't have happened, essentially.
Well, it's a great split to be aware of, and it depends on what we're trying to do. And the whole reason we have science in part, or in a particular angle on science, is because you can actually ask questions of accuracy that are different than questions of value. You can separate it out with a fair degree of utility. So I'm not saying you should never do it, but I'm saying in your life, and to live life in a particular way, in the way justification systems actually function in the world, the whole reason you care about an is because you also have a feeling about an ought.
Right. You want to do something, so you gather truth or care about
100%. That's how we actually work. And then if justification systems are these networks, okay, and then what I basically did is I did sort of a meta-analysis of justification about the kinds of value structures that justification systems exhibit across a wide variety of different contexts.
Okay.
And ultimately develop the meta value meta values of dignity, well-being, and integrity. Okay.
And those are meta values. Why?
Because when you extract out across generalizable structures you just go up the scale of human organization and then look for particular kinds of systems that are constantly being legitimized, then you can extract these particular structures as a tripartite that affords very good clarity about what you're oriented toward.
Okay, so they're just the most stable three.
They're most stable three, and then
people are trying everything. And then
but
the ones that are succeeding, these are everywhere.
Right. So the way then I abstract that is I say, okay, well, the dignity comes explicitly, I'm going to ground it at the level of human justification. Dignity exists in the United Declaration of Human Rights as a most consensually agreed upon document ever that is utilized to justify justice and the treatment of individuals and the legal protection of individuals. So dignity is a concept that was utilized to legitimize justice in the United Declaration of Human Rights, which is the most consensually agreed upon document ever.
So I buy it. I like dignity quite a bit.
So dignity is
respect. Like, are those
right? So it's exactly synonymous. It essentially says it really starts with the idea of we're going to value human beings, and we have some intuitive basic structure about what it is to value them, to show them esteem, and what is it to leave them indignant. That's essentially all it says. And that the difference between being dignified and treated with dignity versus being treated indignantly and with a complete disrespect is in it. This is a dimension of what is good, and we're going to value dignity that way. And that then becomes, if you didn't value human dignity at all, and by the way, I'm going to connect this back into sort of negentropic flourishing. Okay, these are necessitative structures for negentropic flourishing. So dignity is actually the valuing process of valuing humans themselves, and the necessity to value. Then you look at the World Health Organization. World Health Organization values well-being at the biological, psychological, its mission.
Right. You need well-being to be able to have dignity. If you have no well-being,
you have no well-being, you're in trouble.
Not great. Okay, so, I understand that.
So
in work psychology, we have tons of well-being research, but meaningfulness, which dignity would be in, is like, what? We just want to whip these mules and make widgets. What are you talking about? We want the leader to get all the praise. Like, there's huge leadership knowledge and research, but like the positive psych, which I've asked you about before too, it's really not valued by most psychologists, this idea of dignity or beyond well. It's like, no, breathing. They have healthcare, but do they feel self-respect, or do they feel external respect? And then what did you say? Integrity was the third one?
Well, then integrity, which I argue. So well-being, and then I actually defined well-being. That's the nested model here I developed because it was complicated about what I mean. So I had spent some time delineating that. So the unified theory actually affords a descriptive metaphysical system for well-being. And then integrity, which refers to truth, honesty, and honor. But basically then you can delineate science, I would argue. Science seeks integrity in relationship to how it structures its analysis, and it seeks truth. And so science, the World Health Organization, United Nations are all generalizable institutions that virtually all modern cultures lean toward or lean into and see value from. And the other thing that you do, this shows up on the little wisdom energy icon in the seed, is that I correspond dignity to the valuation process, and that's going to actually create to the transcendental beauty. I correspond well-being to goodness, and I correspond integrity to truth. So I see these, if we can then abstract further into philosophy and say, well, what are the ultimate goods that people tend to have sought? You get a goodness, truth, and beauty in a philosophical analysis. So in the manifestation of human institutions, you get a massive amount of consensus that dignity is necessary. You get well-being and integrity, like don't lie, shit like that, and then find the truth. And then you see this in philosophy. You say, okay, what are the greats? Goodness, truth, beauty. In this case, well-being, then integrity.
So the part of the problem with like the Cartesians is they just lack integrity. Is they're not willing to like open their eyes to the truth of some of the flaws of their system.
Well, I mean, that would be a potentially. I mean, it depends on the. I mean, depends on what you believe in relationship to whether or not you have integrity and the angle that you would be. So there's the honesty piece. If I tell you everything I believe, I may be a fool in one sense. So you could say, well, you lack soundness in the argument, but you have honesty. So integrity's got to, like all of these things. I talk about fundamental and incremental dignity, levels of well-being. There are a number of different facets to each one of them. They're complicated constructs. So I wouldn't just say you have a single dimension of integrity. So if somebody's lying to you and manipulating you, then they lack integrity in that dimension. Okay. So there's honesty, truth dimensions, there's soundness and coherence dimensions to integrity that all are part of what, that would go into the various aspects of valuing that particular element. If there's a particular transcendental, I think it aligns most clearly.
Well, yeah, it's very reasonable what you're proposing, what you're asking of people.
So then I'm saying that there is an higher order justificatory meta value structure whereby if we're actually legitimizing kinds of things, and you can then look at what people are claiming. And I argue basically nobody comes out, I like to call this the false bad justification. Okay. No, this is true of Hitler or anybody else. No one comes to you and says, what I'm about to tell you is completely false and will hurt both of us. And let's get behind it. Okay. So that's interesting. Although you'll see people make other people claim that what they say is bullshit and it's hurting us. So the idea that a justification system is both wrong and bad is totally legitimate. But what you can't get is you can't get a motivated system, a motivated phenomenology that has interest and influence that actually believes it's both wrong and bad.
Well, that's what's so interesting about ancient philosophy is they're very good at that point, right? Aristotle argues that everyone cares about the good, and Plato and Socrates, and if you can start to see the world that way, then you're way more sympathetic to fools and to people that are under false beliefs and stuff like that. And
well, if you through the justification hypothesis, you realize that the legitimizing function is after accuracy and solving interest problems. That's why it's going to be you're a motivated reasoner, and it's going to be motivated either through consistency, accuracy, or it's going to be motivated through interest and goodness. And that's why the justifications can be, well, this really sucks, but it's true. Or I don't know if it's true, but we want to believe it because it's positive.
Yeah, so Hitler is like saying it's good to kill all these people.
Right, but why does he say that? Because of disease, and they bring us down, and they're not really people anyway.
Right.
He's wrong, of course, obviously.
Right, the true part is missing, but the good part is all like,
but listen to him. It's like, hey, you're a good person on the in-group, you're Aryans, and these are diseased people that are bringing your children down. So it is good. That's the case, and it is therefore good for us to unite and put them in concentration camps. That's the justification system is, hey, there's a claim here. This threatens us. They all do that. Everybody that tries to justify tries to say, hey, this is the scenario. It will be better if we do this. That's what no one says. I'm lying to you about the scenario, and if you follow me, you'll be worse off. No one says that. Even though we can say that Hitler actually basically, was false and bad in terms of his consequence, but he doesn't, of course. No one can adopt the position of false badness. It's actually a high dissonance. It's essentially, the dissonance is the mechanism of trying to maintaining a justified state of being, and it presses both against accuracy and goodness. That is, you try to maintain an accuracy and you maintain a goodness. To idea that you would invest in an inaccurate bad, what I call false bad beliefs, is actually the system can't invest in false bad beliefs authentically. You could fake it, but actually you can't get your investment influence system actually really do that, or at least take a lot of effort. So anyway, that's an interesting feature of our systems of justification. They were trying to legitimize
those are all really
the is or the ought.
Yeah, deep, great philosophical points, and then persuasion matters a lot more in your system, and so that's part of like the political problem, right? Is because both people don't talk; they just say you're false bad and you're false bad, and then they spin out in their own directions, and instead of harmonizing and coordinating.
Well, to the extent that we turn a political system into a win-loss game, which is basically what extreme polarization of political system does, is it turns the primary act of the to gain influence over the other and have the other lose influence. That's what it's trying to do. The danger, it is fine to have a dialectical tension between political parties to the extent that the political parties become completely antithetical. I use the analogy that the political party's responsibility is not to create a governance system for the people. Is pretty similar to the responsibility of parents to manage a system for children. Now that's
I was just wondering about that with like scale and variance. So there is a lot of scale and variance in your view.
Yeah, you're certainly microscopic, fractal kinds of things. Now let's see what happens in a marriage. Okay, in a marriage, and you have these archetypal. Well, you have an instrumental structure very often in a male that's going to be a little bit more judgmental, a little bit more edgy, a little bit more take responsibility for yourself. And you're going to have a more caring, egalitarian, softer presence, which, by the way, is going to be archetypally Democratic versus Republican in relation to our two-party systems. And that actually plays itself out yin-yang in a wide variety of different dimensions because there's archetypal cooperative care and competitive rank kinds of structures around freedom dynamics that are the influence matrix shares. And it says, yes, there's a self quadrant, there's another quadrant. Archetypally masculine will be more oriented self, archetypally feminine will be more oriented to other clear mammal primate reasons for that. You know, I mean, it's been a very short time in terms of geologic time than us mammals actually giving a shit about our offspring, other than killing them.
No, alligators, like
own,
the female alligators are so aggressive because they have to be to keep the male alligators from eating their babies. So
I mean, you know,
yeah, like these are,
happens
I
with
made
lions,
a baby
it happens,
and then I ate it for food. Yeah, so these
yeah,
are
I
the
mean,
same.
Anyway,
beings
so
from
the
one
bottom
planet.
line is that you can then, within a family, then what you want generally is you want an animus anima balance to create with love about the respect and the honor of the children, and then discipline. So you get authoritative parenting, which says, here's the reasons for what we do, and we listen to you, and there's an iterative feedback that we love you, and create a structure that's balanced around cooperation, competition, and ultimately grounded in love. That's what you want. And you can have a dialectical tension between the archetypal feminine but the goal, what you want in a good marriage is, oh, I look at my wife, I say, oh God, thank God you're playing that role, even though in this case, archetypally, you're the more nurturing and soft one. I love that you play that role well. I'm going to be a little harder. I'm going to be a little edgier, a little more competitive. And you hope I play that role well, because challenge and support as a dialectic in good ways is a very good way to raise children. Okay. So now you then bring that out, and that's what the government wants. The government wants to say, hey, you have individual responsibility, take responsibility for what you do, go out there, you know, have liberty, but you're going to have responsibility. And, oh, wait a minute, there's a lot of unfairness. We need to create a lot of egalitarian protection, and we need to hold the weak and the vulnerable. So you get, okay, classic liberal versus, conservative structures.
Yeah.
As long as they respect each other and say, when you're a really good conservative, you're actually exemplifying some key aspect of the system and I will honor you. And when you're a really good liberal, you're doing some really important thing, and actually in healthy tension between the best of your liberal nurturing and equality stuff and the best of your conservative freedom and respect for tradition stuff, we're actually doing really good shit.
You can cover more ground, but
it's a healthy
part, if you feels like.
Right. Well, if you know the matrix, you know, healthy opponent process between competition, freedom, and love is exactly where you get high relational value, high social influence effectiveness. Because it's like, be good competitors, be good lovers, have freedom, and then manifest that in a particular structure. Okay. So you want good dialectics between the poles. Now, what you actually get in our current structure is, oh my God, if we say leftist wokeism, like, we actually care about people who've been unbelievably oppressed, and you guys are unbelievable fucking assholes who want to maintain the white male supremacy because you're actually inherently evil. Okay. And then you get, oh my God, you're trying to create a complete new ideology based on some insanity in relationship to blah, blah, blah. And you guys are completely brainwashed, and you're going to ruin our society. So now you get this complete, you are the bad person, and what I need to do is I need to completely undermine you. If we bring it back to the family, and if you bring it back to the family, it's like, mom, hey, I bring my kids in. Psst, mom is a horrible person.
Oh, that's the worst. I'm sure. I mean, as a psychologist,
from a psychologist,
but exactly, it's so bad when
as soon as they turn against each other,
against the parents. Oh, it's so ugly. It's
okay. So welcome to our polarized society.
Wow,
what is
our
political our political parties are trying to grab you and tell you that the other side is an unbelievable, dangerous person, and they think really operate not to cooperate, but for the greater good, but they operate to gain influence away from the evil people who are trying to gain influence in the other direction. And so then you get this entire structure of skepticism, of mistrust, of hostility, of polarization, of can't work together on basic structures, because you're always tearing the other down, because their victories are our losses and our victories are their losses, which is exactly that's a destructive opponent process. And it gives rise ultimately like borderline personality kinds of structures, where everybody's like crazy and vacillating and erratic and vulnerable and mistrustful. And we do that at the macro scale. And you're going to see why it's going to be hard to then coordinate a system that's actually got a hell of a fuckload of problems that are very complicated, that better need to be done with clarity, accuracy, and oriented toward goodness, instead of, a destructive win in the short term mentality, which is, of course, that's what I feel like we have. And that's why I get a little scared and frustrated.
No, it's an incredibly interesting thing. I mean, I remember September 11th when actually everyone agreed for a minute. There was a moment where everyone came together and we were all focused, like the Robert Cialdini, like those kind of social psych.
Totally.
Oh, the bus breaks down and everyone comes together.
Everyone comes together, 100%.
But that's really like the last time, and I was hoping after Trump didn't win the election that the Trump narrative would die, and it hasn't even. It's just we're in this weird no consensus. You can't talk to people, and Yeah, that makes
Yep.
a lot
No,
of
no.
sense. The way you're saying is it's really just a broken
Once the
down.
justification systems get defined against one another,
Mhm,
which means they actually drop into the hostility space on the matrix,
uh,
their interests are defined against the interests of the other, so that if you get benefit, they experience that as a loss and vice versa. If you have that hostility, then that's an inherently reciprocal vicious cycle of
yeah,
destruction. And that's why hostility is it creates an enormous amount of entropy, because it's fundamentally destructive. Now, that's not to say you never need it. Obviously, sometimes there is, but systematic hostility between groups, and that's a very, very
yeah. That's
vulnerable.
interesting to call it like negative, like entropy. So there's all this like waste building up in the system that needs to
Well, you're
be
just
processed out, and it
you're
isn't.
destroying a lot of the energy of hostility is to injure and constrain the other, so your work
Yeah,
effort is to break the other down. Breaking down is happening all the time anyway. You're spending energy to break down, they're going to spend energy to break down back, so you get a breakdown. The work effort is to break down. That's going to spread entropy pretty quick.
yeah. Oh, it's so interesting. I love thinking about this stuff because again, like in 10 days, it'll all sink in and I'll be able to see things differently. And oh yeah. Because culture is so sometimes it's so easy to see and sometimes it's so hard to see. But if you can like when you have these nice simple models to kind of put on top of things, then you can go, oh no, these are kind of the patterns that are playing out, and most likely this is what's going to happen, and these are some solutions, or I better walk away. That's kind of my solution to that
Right.
political stuff is like I'm just going to let the bear fight the tiger, and I'll come back in a week and see if there's any animals still here. Um,
Yeah, no, I'm basically checked out of the political arena
it's
myself.
a
So
bummer because like I don't know, my grandparents were part of the greatest generation, and it sounded like such a nice time to be alive, and America was so building up and going to the moon and making roads and doing all this really interesting stuff. And now, if I don't agree with you ideologically, you don't even want to talk to me. Like,
that's it.
and
Yep.
and it's like you look at like social media and the most controversial stuff is often the most watched. So it's even more
Totally.
disheartening. Like uh it's so weird. But it's
Yep.
exciting
Yep.
too, right? Because I guess when old systems break down, again, as long as like you said at the beginning, the planet isn't the victim as well, then something better could emerge, or something at least that hasn't been tried will
Well, right.
emerge.
I'm super happy, super lucky. I feel unbelievably fortunate that my little baton of energy information found itself in a specific place that does feel like it's right on the edge of this transformation and plays a role in the phase transition, and just draws so much of my energy. I have so much love and gratitude and hope within it. So
Yeah,
yeah, it's a
yeah.
wonderful, and that you don't really get that unless you're in a phase transition time. And so, although I'm
That
super
is true.
scared and
Yeah. John
you
always
know,
like talks about the Kairos and he's using his
yeah, it's
arms and stuff. And
right. No, I
we
feel like
are
the kairotic moment is real, and I feel like I'm a little part of it in a with a really kind of special, unique location, and that's really cool. So at some level, as I'm scared and frustrated and worried and hope for the best
yeah.
outcome, it's also like, oh my God, it's also I get to be here, and I really wouldn't change my life with
No,
anything.
me
It's
neither. It's
amazing.
such a beautiful community. There's so much love and intelligence and newness. And yeah, it's just I did the circling weekend a couple of weeks
Oh,
ago with Guy and Christopher and John, and I met a bunch of strangers and they were like really smart and into practicing, and like I'd share some work I had heard. They go, "Oh, I've never heard of that." And then they'd share something like, "Oh, I've never heard of that." And it's just like cultures feeding each other, and
lovely.
it's so cool. And the practices, like it's kind of sad that I guess because of Christianity's dominance, but I don't know why, but like just there's so much wisdom practices that people like John and Guy and that just they're so good for you. That's
Yeah.
so good to like just and it's not when you have especially like what you're doing and what John's doing, when you have a vocabulary to be able to say to a stranger, "Oh, I do Tai Chi because I'm an embodied, embedded, or I have behavioral trade-offs, and I found that this does the most for my well-being and dignity and things like that." When you can start to have that cultural cognitive grammar and this kind of like more than just one practice or two things, but like this whole synergizing thing. And you can make sense of these texts. That's another thing I love about your listserv and some of the other communities I'm with, is like I would have to find like a college to take a class once in a while and maybe have a cool professor or meet a buddy. But we like some of the threads get really deep, and some of the conversations that are on YouTube or wherever else they
Totally.
all are, oh no, this is actual new thinking that's changing people's lives. And yeah, it would be awesome if you could just like hit a button and all of America bought into this simultaneously, like some color vision on Wizard of Oz. Like, oh no, it's all in color now. We're all saved. But like you said, just to be a part of it is it's humbling. It really is. Like I even love, like I was saying, I love the little painted rocks that you did, and just seeing that stuff come into the world, and knowing you now that I'm just not seeing you as like a character in a series. Like I know you now, and I know like, oh, that's not just him doing a stunt or something. He was excited by that, and it's really yeah, it's kind of beautiful. I think in the same way, probably having a like a child and seeing the child is like, oh, this is so cool. What's going on here?
That
The
is.
the community is. I want to see what happens now that COVID is kind of over, because I think
Yeah.
COVID brought everyone together because it was scary, dark times. And now that everyone's kind of standard of living is, even though it's so crazy, this world has never been so crazy in my history. But it's cool to see if it keeps growing, and if people kind of continue 3 years later and 5 years later, and where it heads. Because COVID did this cool unifying thing that everyone learned how to be on Zoom, and everyone learned
Yep.
how to like be a little quieter on group calls and do all those kind of social skills that you need to have like a distributed network like this. Um, yeah, so you said a couple things you're excited about. What would you like to see like else? Like how could people behave better or be more experimental, or like what are some other
Yeah.
ways?
I need to go here in about 10,
Oh,
5,
sure. Yeah,
10
what time
minutes.
is it? Oh, boy.
But
Yeah.
I mean, well, why don't I just say, yeah, my goal is for the next, by the end of the year, is consolidating the UTOK system so the UTOK language becomes more accessible, and to understand what it's help people see what it offers them and deliver that in a way that's a lot more digestible.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
right,
No, because like I've
yeah,
said, it is so valuable. I'm a little
uh,
spoiled. Part of the reason I can appreciate it is because I've studied so many pieces of it from
right.
their disciplines. But seeing, yeah, seeing people value it is a whole cool thing.
So that's what my
Yeah.
hope, like the system is really distributed. I wanted to finish this book, and now I want to come back. I did this UTOK 20 thing,
Yeah, I
which
loved
I
it.
think
I
was
told you that, I think.
yeah, and that's an example of what I mean. I'm actually creating a series of up to 40 videos, that will be 5 to 10 minutes each, 15 on key terms. So we've done the first 7 of them.
Oh, wow.
We'll be releasing them soon. It's called Now You Talking. So basically, so there's a little intro, and then we talk about behavior, and then we talk about mind, and then we talk about cognition and consciousness, and self and
Awesome.
person, and ego, and metaphysics, and the meta crisis and fifth joint point. That's so then you'd have 15 videos of about 5 to 10 minutes each, where you'd be like, okay, here are the way you talk about these terms, and
Yeah,
this
yeah,
is what
yeah.
this does. And then we'll go through the UTOK 20, which is the 4 problems and then the 20 solutions. Try to do 5 minutes on each one of those. And then that would do is then I would afford at least a landscape. And then the other thing I got was a course release, which was sort of fortuitous. I didn't even ask for it, a complicated set of circumstances. But whatever, I got a course release to develop a UTOK course. So I'm
Awesome.
going to be doing that. And that'll be for JMU, but it would also then be looking for online course opportunities.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Explore that. And the other
Cool.
thing is we're going to
Perfect.
consolidate. If you look at the web page, I mean, when I first opened it, this relationship between the garden and the coin, and then the heart of the academic, theory is these 4 ideas for the unified theory and the 4 ideas for the unified approach. UTOK's actually a lot bigger than that, but that's how I started the 8 key ideas. We got to upgrade it. We have to get clear that really what this is really a new philosophy that affords clarity about science, psyche, and wisdom.
Yeah.
These are these interrelated places that solve the enlightenment gap. And why is that the case? Why? I also want to be very clear. Although this looks really new and weird, and it's like, oh, science and spirituality, and there's elephant sun god, and all this other.
Well, you're
actually
learning how people perceive you. Like it
Yeah,
makes perfect sense to you. That's what I love
right.
about you, and I trust about you is that it does. It's not just weird symbols that use imaginary numbers and elephants and stuff. It's a way of seeing the world the same way it must have been weird when like the apostles were going, no, 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 Rome, we got this thing. Come on, Jews, get in this church, you Jews.
Exactly right.
You know, so it's
what,
no, I
one
love
of the things I want to.
This is a great step. Yeah.
Good, I appreciate that. But one of the things I really want to make very clear as I've talked to people is like, actually, it's an unbelievably conservative system. Ironically,
no, it's very reasonable, but it's so high up. That's what I think people
like,
struggle with because when you have a great high up, there's still all the details of pleasure.
So that's what makes it confusing. But at least I want people to know that this thing is just grounded in just a straightforward scientific naturalism, and not in a hostile way towards anything that I would call exo-natural kinds of phenomenon. But it's really just about getting naturalism right, and then getting naturalism in a way that allows us to appreciate the sacred and our subjectivity. And that's totally, and the beauty is that's totally available to us coherently. We have there's available coherence, and we haven't had that before. Science broke that coherence, and that's super exciting, because if we can actually get a coherence, knowledge into wisdom system on science, psyche, and wisdom itself, that's amazing. And that really would be a part of a solution to, transforming us through this next age, this axial, the new axial age or whatever, and affording us, the kind of vision that John is so beautifully articulating. If we get the knowledge system,
you can keep the knowledge and gain the wisdom, because the wisdom people hate the knowledge, and the knowledge people hate the wisdom, and for kind of fair reasons mostly. Like they're innocent reasons, but like yeah, I've straddled both, and I read the Bhagavad Gita and the Bible, and then Journal of Applied Psychology and statistics books, and I've sacrificed maybe having a family to do that, but it's worth it to me because I can learn things like your system with that background, and it actually benefits me to have a system. But yeah, like getting those two things
if it were the case that our kindergartens were organized by a garden, if it were the case that our elementary schools,
the rocks,
universities, the idea that there is a knowledge system that's up to the task that allows you to enter into a portal, sift out the bullshit, and organize the structure with coherent intelligibility and comprehensiveness across the various domains of knowing, well, that's exciting. So that's what I'll leave us with.
I don't think you could top that. You'd have to actually make the elephant sun god appear to have anything more spectacular.
Well, thanks to Tim Adalin. Maybe we'll figure out ways of getting.
Oh, I saw that. Yeah, I've used Midjourney with Tim. Midjourney is awesome. We could make some AI Gregg art. That would be so fun one day.
All right.
Great to see you, Greg. I'm glad you're feeling better. And
yes,
sounds like
super good. It's good to be back, and I look forward to this back half of this year. And thanks so much for all the questions. It's great.
Oh yeah, I love you, Greg. Take care.
All right, man. Take care.